Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Chico Chakravorty on the show. Welcome to you, Chico.
Hi, very lovely to be here, Julian.
Good to see you. You are the founder and managing consultant of Doing Diversity Differently, where you help organisations to enhance their culture, improve employee belonging, and do diversity differently. And today we will be exploring diversity inclusion and looking how we can create that sort of behavioural change against sort of root cause within an organisation, and also touching on the different types of diversity, including cognitive diversity. So before we get there, Chico, I would love to know what do you love about what you do?
Um, that's a really good question. I think there's an awful lot that I love. Um, the reason I guess I started the organization was having worked in a really broad spectrum of both functions and industries. I kept on seeing certain things happen within organizations where either the culture was fantastic or the culture wasn't great. And for me, I think that's something that is really critical to enabling diversity and, more importantly, inclusion and belonging to really thrive and succeed within an organization. So when I get to work with different organizations, whether that be on training programs, whether that be working with them to do a sort of survey that kind of then develops into a strategy or a report to help recommend how people can increase that sense of inclusion and belonging within their organization, and knowing the impact that that has to individuals, especially those that are underrepresented within those organizations. I think that's probably the bit that I love the most.
And you mentioned there belonging, because obviously there's diversity, there's inclusion, there's belonging, there's equity as well, isn't there?
Absolutely.
And so it'd be good to just expand a bit more upon that, because people tend to just hear D&I
Absolutely.
and what that really means, and what are these belonging, what's this equity, and how does that play, and what does that mean to you, but what does it mean to an organization?
So I think there was a really great quote by the chief diversity officer of Netflix, someone called Werner Myers. And the quote is, "Diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance." So you can kind of very clearly see the difference in terms of, well, I can be there, but I don't necessarily have that ability to participate. But for me, when I look at that quote, I actually think both of those statements are still very passive. I still have to wait to be invited. I still have to wait to be asked to dance at the party. So what I help organizations try and create is that sense of belonging. And the way I then extend the quote is by saying, if diversity is being asked to the party and inclusion is being asked to, invited to dance, then belonging is choosing the music on the playlist and bringing food to the buffet table. So I have no, there is nothing there that's stopping me wanting to do this on my own. There are no barriers preventing me from doing it off my own steam. And that's where we want to be able to get to. It's not just about having the representation within our workforce. It's not just about them being in the meetings. It's about, where does that, I guess, autonomy of voice sit? Where does the ability for someone to feel engaged lie, for them to want to then be more productive and generate better results for the organization as well as themselves?
I really like the idea that belonging quotes, and when you added to it in terms of you can sort of add to the music, you can bring food, and you feel, I suppose, valued in that context as well. And I suppose we all need to feel a sense of belonging.
Absolutely.
But I like it's more of an active thing rather than a passive thing.
Yes.
When we look at D&I, equity and belonging, and I won't keep sort of missing out the belonging piece here. How do companies do it badly? And it sounds like we're starting on a negative. I think sometimes we can learn from where people do it really badly and not appropriately do it. They're saying they're doing, but they're not doing it. So what's your experience, either what you've read, what you've observed, what you've gone into organizations where they've just not done it very well?
I think it's important to understand that this is not kind of something where one organization is doing it fantastically and other organizations are doing it terribly. There is going to be a journey. It's going to change. And there's a number of reasons why it changes. Part of that is the environment that we live in and geopolitical events that happen around us. Part of it will be the different people that come in and out of an organization where it means different things to them. I would say those organizations that don't do particularly well are the ones that are aware of it and have chosen not to do anything about it at all. Though that is a very deliberate choice in terms of going, well, we know that there is a wealth of data out there that sits and supports the fact that, diversity is beneficial to businesses, both on a commercial level, on a people level, whatever dimension you look at that on, but we're just not going to do it. And in some ways,
why do you think that they're choosing not to engage with this, knowing the fact that there is huge amounts of data out there that says you have a more diverse, included population in your business, you're going to increase your bottom line? It's a fact. So why would they not choose to do that as a tactic, even if it's done in a way that's just purely driven by money?
So I would say there's probably two things. One is when we look at different concepts. So one of the concepts is what's classed as the status quo bias, i.e., I know that something needs to change, but until the platform is burning, I'm just going to go as is. So I will just stick with the status quo until something fundamentally goes wrong. That may well be that we have a grievance or a complaint, or it may well be something that happens at a much larger level. So a lot of organizations have resulted in addressing their diversity and inclusion challenges because of what's happening in the wider world. So if we think about the Me Too movement, if we think about what's happening in terms of race relations as a result of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter reignition in 2020, what we're seeing currently with trans rights in workplaces, in society, etc., those are points where people go, this is the change that I need. But up until that point, I'm probably not going to do anything about it because I have other priorities. It may well be that we can't see that tangible increase to our bottom line. I'm investing this amount of capital expenditure into a diversity and inclusion initiative, but what I'm not necessarily seeing is a direct result coming out of it because it is something softer. So I would say that's one of the reasons. The second, I think, is that sometimes it might feel threatening. Sometimes it might feel uncomfortable to think that in order for one person to succeed or thrive or flourish, another person has to relinquish that they already have. So it's kind of almost seen as a zero-sum game, right? And that's actually, again, I think a fallacy, because if we're seeing all this data that says that, if we have a diverse leadership within our organization, then that drives innovation revenue by 19% and overall EBIT by 9%, according to a study done by Boston Consulting Group. There are lots of very similar studies out there. What we're seeing is there's more to invest back into the organization to create new opportunities. So it doesn't have to take something away from you. It's not what people say is it's not just one pie or one cake that you are taking a slice of. You can think about how you cut that pie differently. You can think about, actually, can we now afford a bigger pie dish, which has more opportunity for different people? So I would say that would be one of the key things in terms of barriers for especially leaders within organizations to want to drive this through. And I guess the third bit is the concept around privilege. And privilege is one of those words that feels a little bit accusatory. It feels like, if I say to you, Julian, you have privilege, you're sat there going, well, you don't know anything about me. You don't know how hard I've had to work in order to get here, or whether I've had an easy life or not. But I don't think privilege is that. Privilege for me is when we don't face barriers or challenges purely based on who we are. And a really simple way that you can see this played out, there's a number of YouTube videos that look at, or videos on other platforms as well, I should probably say, that look at what's called a privilege race. So people are asked different questions and they step either forward or back, depending on what their response is. And I think the really interesting thing about this is when people towards the front that have held privilege look back at who isn't necessarily with them at the same starting point, they were completely unaware of those advantages that they may well have had, that structurally exist, that means that they have had this thing that they've never even needed to consider when in the workplace. Or, for example, a very simple one that was often seen and is sometimes seen is language that we might use, for example, on a job description, which might have historically said he/she will be able to, they will be able to do a thing in their job description. Now, what we actually see is the fact that as a result of this, women will often be slightly disengaged because they see themselves second to men. So if we change some language, which is saying that they will do X, Y, Z, that tends to have a very different result as an outcome.
And do you think the organizations who are potentially looking at this and for some reason not seeing the benefits or the long-term benefits from the financial, and not just financial here, but if that's one driver, do you think also fear is stopping them? Fear of the unknown, the fear of change, the fear of, I'm not entirely sure how can I handle somebody who's from a different, not just race, but different sort of background to me as an identity. And do you think that's one of the sort of key drivers that people tend to sort of hold as in leadership?
I think in leadership, definitely. And especially when we see leadership teams being fairly homogenous, i.e. looking similar in terms of not just gender or ethnicity, but what type of schools they might have gone to, or what subjects they studied at universities, or the types of organizations they've gone to. You kind of think in a certain way. That all kind of forms what you touched on earlier, which is your cognitive experience and your cognitive diversity. When those are similar, we tend to have more aligned thinking. I think actually one of the bigger fears is intrinsically most people are good, and they like to think of themselves as good. So the fear is more about, I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to upset someone. I'm going to cause some level of offense, which I never intended to do. So therefore, my natural behavior will either be to be defensive around it, or potentially to completely shut down, withdraw, and pretend that this isn't happening at all. So I think that's the biggest fear. And for me, one of the things that I like to say is actually it's much more important to understand what it is that we can do to step away from the mistake that we may well have made, and just acknowledge the fact that we're going to make mistakes. Let's be clumsily human on this journey. Let's think about how we can shift our impact to be something slightly more positive. So if we do say something wrong, if we do, for example, use the wrong gender pronouns for somebody, and somebody points that out to us, we can obviously say, oh, that's not what I meant. You've misunderstood me. Or you can say, I'm really sorry. I'm going to promise to do better next time. I might still make a mistake. But actually, by making that mistake, that's how we learn. We don't learn through being comfortable. If we think about being children and we're 6 or 7, we don't learn how we are doing things such as spelling developing our spelling skills by using the word cat or dog, we actually push ourselves to use bigger words, don't we? Like, disappoint. That's how we start learning, because it's not things that we already know. So yes, that's where the challenges will be.
So just building upon that, in terms of, there's a lot of organizations I perceive as doing sort of whole diversity and inclusion in the context of just a tick box exercise. Absolutely. And they do it to produce stats, produce numbers and PR, everything else. And they're just being motivated by the sort of society. That's what you ought to do, rather than what's the right thing to do. So how do we get organizations in a place where it goes from being a tick box to genuinely doing something that they really want to do, but also create true behavioral changes, rather than just, oh, I have to do this, I have to employ so many people on my board, I have to interview so many female, or whatever it is, the quota thing. It comes a genuine desire and behavioral change. What sort of 2 or 3 things have you experience, and how you help companies to do that?
It's a really, really good question. And I think, we move through these different stages of what diversity and inclusion looks like and how it presents itself. So if we're doing just compliance-led initiatives, which are the tick box, i.e. on a job application, we have put a statement at the bottom saying, we welcome applications from people of all genders and ethnicities and sexual orientations and any other protected characteristic. That's effectively something that's compliance-led. We're not necessarily doing what the behavior change is that enables those people to come in and then flourish if they're successful. So I think a big part of it is taking accountability for our own learning on this. So what are some of the challenges that people may well face? What does that look like? And there's plenty of data and studies that have been done by either consulting firms or universities or government bodies in whichever country or jurisdiction that you may well be in, that talks about some of the challenges that people may well face. Then think about, what can we do to bridge some of those knowledge gaps? Do we need to have some training? Do we need to kind of have someone talk about these things? Do we have people within our own organization that can share their lived experience in terms of what it is that can happen and can be done? And then finally, I think it's by understanding that it's going to be a continual journey, and making sure that when things feel relatively easy in terms of what we're doing, question them. Why is it that easy? Are we asking enough people? I always had one of my previous mentors when I worked in the health insurance industry said that if you've got more than 2 people around the table that agree with you, you've got too many people around the table. Because what we should be able to do is find ways to respectfully challenge and contribute different thoughts and ideas to what the problems that we're solving are. Because without those, we have no idea of what some of those challenges are.
Yeah, I've just been thinking, actually, it seems to me is, we know that having a diversity of people, however that's made up, we don't have to name what that is in terms of whether it's gender, race or cognitive, means you're going to have greater insight into problems, greater understanding. And because I think for years, I always felt this almost positive discriminate, as in almost, oh, I have to employ the various types of races and everything else because that's what we do, which is the wrong way about thinking about it. It's just so, but actually, if I go have a mindset and says, look, I've got an organization, I know diversity is benefit, I want to employ a diverse number of people or have diverse teams, and have that as your intent, as your overarching goal, however that gets made up of, whether it's more whites, blacks, whatever, it doesn't matter in a sense, I don't think. That's where I get caught up when it gets into numbers and stuff. Actually, we've got a diverse team here solving problems. What are your thoughts on that and how we encompass that sort of mindset, really, I guess?
I think it's the right way to approach things. What we want to be able to do is think about what is it that's preventing us seeing those people as the best people, that may well stop that kind of groupthink mentality from happening. It may well be, we acknowledge, for example, we don't have as many female leaders in organizations as we would like to. So what is it that we're doing that's preventing female leaders from being able to be seen and visible? And therefore shift how we are doing the assessment to actually kind of place different importance on things. There's often this whole concept of we just want the best person for the job, which is, the concept of meritocracy. I actually think that meritocracy is a bit of a myth, because when you look at the different types of privilege that we all have, and the different ways that bias can present itself. So, for example, affinity bias is where we choose to take information or we connect with people or hire people that look like us, that think like us, that have had similar experiences to us. We look to conform to how other people in our groups think. So if we are in an environment where people are presenting a particular solution, if we don't have that safety or security in our culture to raise different thoughts as suggestions, we're not going to contribute them. We look to confirm what it is that we already know, because then that derives value within ourselves to be able to make ourselves think of internally that we are good at what we do and the things we are. So we can think about how do we reframe some of those assessments. We can think about how we reframe how we engage with our people to make sure that actually that diverse team is coming through. We can think about some of the questions that we're asking, where, if we're driving a project and everything does seem easy, we can sit there and go, let's take a stop. Why is this so easy? What are we missing? Who are we not asking about whether this could be even more effective, a product or a solution or a service that we're designing? And it's when organizations don't do that. And there have been so many through history. So, for example, one of my favorite examples is, back in the early 2000s, 48% of the world had a mobile handset that had a green screen that you could play Snake on. And when you walked down the high street, you would nearly always hear a very specific ringtone. And that was Nokia. And when you ask them sort of in the early or the mid 2000s what they thought their customers needed, they would have said a phone with more buttons on it to compete with the likes of BlackBerry, where people were starting to be able to access emails and they could write a message more quickly compared to, having to press the 7 key 4 times in order to get the letter S to come up on the screen. What they hadn't thought or seen was the fact that someone was going to come out with a phone with absolutely no buttons on it whatsoever.
Yes.
And that completely took them by surprise. And they found themselves in a very negatively impacted position where they now only hold something like a 2% global market share of handsets. So it's thinking about what is it that we're not seeing as opposed to what is it directly that we are seeing. So that's how I would kind of say, who can we be bringing in? Who are we not hearing? Do they already work for this company? Do we need to get insight from elsewhere to be able to see these things? And I think that's something that would be really useful.
You're talking about cognitive diversity there, in terms of that different way of thinking, different backgrounds. And I think it's not really talked enough of. And I think we need to, I guess, embrace a bit more of that. And we've obviously done a lot of the gender, race, and that's still valuable and important. But I think this different type of thinking to try and spark challenges, which means also you've got to create an environment that is where people feel psychologically safe to challenge, to contribute, and everything else. So, how do we sort of recruit for that sort of cognitive diversity? I mean, you don't put it on an application. Please ensure that you've got a diversity in your cognitive thinking, please. How do we go about sort of making sure we are challenging that internally, but also then starting to bring that into the organization?
I mean, I don't think you can put that into a job advert, because the candidate will have no idea of the team that they're going into. So they would have no idea whether they were cognitively diverse to the other people around them. And I think a really simple way of looking at it is we often do skills mapping in terms of internal exercises to see who has what skills within a particular team or organization. And when we bring someone new, we kind of look at what the function within within that role is, what that team does, and what that organization does. So therefore, what we deem to be valuable criteria is something that's replicating and effectively just reinforcing the skills that we already have within the organization. So when we're recruiting in, a big thing to be able to do is to go, what is it that we don't have? Where can we get that from? How can we get that from other industries? I guess a personal experience of mine was I had my first career pivot going from the performing arts. I used to manage orchestras and worked in radio for the first part of my career after having done a music degree, and then found myself working in international health insurance, taking our products to be regulated in new territories. And I think for me, the really interesting thing was, because I wasn't insurance through and through, because I wasn't health, the questions that I could ask were very different. You know, why is it that we're doing it like that? What would happen if? Are there other ways that we can do this? And that actually meant that our route to market was reduced from anywhere between 2 to 3 years down to just 5 months with one of the first projects I led. It meant that I sort of said, well, why do we need to wait for our products to be fully approved by the regulator before we even start having conversations with customers? Why don't we create a warm pipeline? We can actually also use that insight to design what the product needs are for that country. And that meant that on the day that we went live, we exceeded our business case expectations by 240%. So not only had we done it much quicker, but actually on day one, we'd already generated more revenue than we had forecast to generate in the first year. So thinking about that, but enabling people to think like that. We often bring people into an organization and say, I love all the things that you have done outside. Now, please fit into this tiny way of how we do things here. And very quickly, people become institutionalized. And part of that is, I guess, that feeling of wanting to belong and wanting to fit in. But actually trying to get us to understand, instead of that, how we can add to the culture that we're in is a much stronger proposition for our teams and for our development if we're doing it safely, if we're enabling everyone to be able to do that at the same level.
Yeah, I heard it. You just said it then. I heard a great quote, you know, think of culture add rather than cultural fit. And
absolutely,
it's rather than trying to fit in, actually want to add to this equation and add to what we're doing, and to be perhaps a little bit disruptive. And it's interesting, yeah, that just a simple thing that bringing somebody in from a different industry who's got no experience can actually create some real insights, because they just have different perspectives on things. And, you know, really helps, as you've just done, by you asking perhaps the silly, stupid questions that nobody would dare ask or even think of, made people think differently and created all that sort of benefits.
Absolutely. And thinking about how you can cultivate that culture of curiosity. There were a lot of C's in that. Cultivating a culture of curiosity. I might use that again. But making sure that we are being naturally inquisitive about what it is that we're doing, how we can do this. Because going from managing orchestras into regulating insurance products in other territories, I had no knowledge, but I had a desire and a want to make that feel positive, to make that feel constructive, to do that in a great way. So that was something that I think is something that we should be valuing within our organizations.
Great insights, Chico. Thank you for your sharing. Thank you for your examples. And and certainly in touching on the more the cognitive side, I think it's really helpful. If people are interested in you and what you're doing, how can they sort of connect, get in touch with you?
So I guess the easiest way is either on LinkedIn. So my name is on the screen, Chico Chakravorty, or alternatively go to our website, Doing Diversity Differently, or do feel free to drop me an email at chico@doingdiversitydifferently.com.
Brilliant. Really, thank you for your time today. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Take care.